Today, we welcome Angela Ferraro-Fanning, owner of the Axe Root Homestead, a 6-acre farm in New Jersey, and author of The Sustainable Homestead. She shares her love for eco-conscious, self-sufficient living with others through her books, publications, teaching, and public speaking. Please welcome Angela. Hi. You'll have to come off of mute.
Can you hear me?
There we go.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. We can hear you. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No, the pleasure's mine. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I'll kick us off with some questions and then toward the end we'll open it up to the audience for their questions.
Okay.
I'd first like to ask if you could share the story of how you moved from being a graphic designer to a full-time homesteader.
Sure. It's funny. I actually used to be a graphic and website design owner that had an emphasis on eco-friendly design. And what that means is I would use colors in my print work that were eco-friendly. I was a member of Green America. I had a certified business. All the decisions that I made were with regards to creating promotions for clients that were eco-friendly. So I guess you could say this passion for eco-friendly and sustainable living has just always been in my blood. But that being said, sitting behind a computer all day, every day was really starting to take a toll. And when I had my first child, I kind of went through this big identity shift mixed with postpartum depression. And I thought, you know what? This is not making me happy. I don't want to sit behind a computer all day. I don't want to be at the mercy of client deadlines and calling me up and having to stay late. I want to do something different. I want to be outside and I want to have more time with my family. And I'd always had ornamental gardens and just like a small vegetable garden. But I also had some food allergies and I was worried about my son with food allergies. And, for me, the pesticides that are sprayed on crops is really a trigger. And so I thought if I could combine my love of ornamental gardening with food production, I could be outside and I could grow food for my family. I could still live and walk this sort of eco-friendly line that I've always been in depth and in tune to. And at the same time, I could be outside every day and I could essentially trade my paycheck in for the amount of money I was spending for organic crops at Whole Foods. So my husband was very supportive. And I started to learn everything that I could about not just growing crops, but growing in small spaces because I only had a 3/4 acre property. And I say only, that's quite a bit of land, but still not when you think about trying to produce your own food. And then I also needed to learn how to preserve that food. And it was just this obsession for me. I started researching and learning as much as I could and swapping out ornamental plants for edible crops and learning companion planting and sort of all the tricks that come into play with growing upwards. And it snowballed. I became hooked. And yeah, now here I am.
It's incredible. So I don't know, I'm inclined to call it a philosophy. You follow permaculture practices. And I was curious, how did you learn about permaculture in the first place, and why is it important to you when creating your homestead?
Yeah, that's a good question. So being eco-friendly minded, it wasn't just about having a garden or starting a farm. It was about giving more back to the land than what I was taking. And I mentioned before, I didn't want to use or be in contact with any pesticides or chemicals. So I had to learn companion planting and how to use plants to actually give back to soil, but also give back to each other and create these little ecosystems to create healthier crops that wouldn't require so much intervention daily on the part of the grower. And we can touch on that in a little bit. But for me, I called it holistic homesteading. And then I learned that there was a name for this, that it was called permaculture. And when I learned that it actually had a title and it had been around for a long time, and there were these great practitioners who founded it, the resources in the library just opened up, and I was able to learn so much more, get certified through Cornell, and it's just been something that I'm so passionate about. I think we've, as a society, turned to putting humans and our desires and our wants and needs at the epicenter of our crops and how to grow food, when really it should be we're stewards of the land. We grow what works in our climate or in our geographical location. We trade with others what we can't grow and what they can. And it's more community and land centric as opposed to so individualized, putting the needs of us first. I think it's gotten a little bit backwards.
I couldn't agree more. Our current food system leaves a lot to be desired at the moment, and how we manage the land.
Yes.
Could you share what the 3 pillars of permaculture are with us?
Yes. And if you're okay with it, I'll share my screen.
Please do.
I have some images to kind of go along with what we're talking about today. Okay, everybody can see that okay, I hope. So we have a 6-acre farm here in central New Jersey. And again, we're using, or I'm passionate about incorporating permaculture methods, which means that I am trying to create a working ecosystem that mimics patterns in nature to achieve food sustainability, to be able to sustain my land, rebuild soil, to be able to sustain my animals. So I'm trying to really rebuild, regrow, while still being able to maintain a sense of personal food security. You know, you see this garbage can floating here. And the reason that I put that on here is we've been experiencing a lot of challenges. We experience flooding, which is where the garbage can comes in. We've been experiencing drought. And I'm in central New Jersey. We're getting wildfire smoke from Canada. We're experiencing pressure from climate that we haven't had in the past. And so I think there's a level of adaptation that comes into play. And that's kind of where the 3 permaculture principles comes in, is that in permaculture, the belief is that you're caring for the earth. And if you care for the earth through sustainable practices, it in turn will care for you. And then hopefully, if you've cared for it well enough, and if the earth is providing an abundance, you should have a surplus that you can then share with others. And, you know, I touched on that before with growing crops, for example. I know that here in central New Jersey, elderberries are native and they thrive, but that might not be the case for somebody else based on their location. Well, what do they have that they can really grow well and can thrive? And so in sharing the surplus, we're trying to facilitate such strong crops, strong land, that we're not only meeting up the needs of our own selves, but of others. So that's the 3 principles of permaculture. Did you want me to keep going?
You are welcome to, if you want to share any other permaculture practices you incorporate, or
Yeah, so I'm happy to talk a little bit about the working ecosystem we have here. So what makes my farm a little bit different is that every plant and animal serves a need. Everything is connected and everything affects something else. So we'll start with our honeybees. A lot of homesteaders who bring in honeybees, they think of honey, right? That's the primary use for the bees. But for us, that's actually the last reason I have honeybees. I enjoy honey, but I don't use them with harvest in mind. I actually use them to help increase our pollination. And that doesn't mean that we don't feed and don't cater and invite native pollinators. We do all of that. What we are seeing, though, is a high increase when we keep a number of hives on the property. So that's what the bees are for. We use ducks. Central New Jersey is a wet, humid climate, and it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to go out to the garden every single day to spend time weeding, picking off slugs and snails, which are some of our major pest pressures that we have in our growing spaces. So when I look at the problem, in permaculture, we say the problem is the solution. For me, it's snails and slugs. So what don't I have enough of to help eradicate the snails and slugs? So that would be waterfowl, specifically ducks. Ducks are great. They go through the garden and the growing spaces. Their webbed feet don't tear up our earth or our crops, and they pick out all of those slugs. They pick out the snails, and the crops are left intact. Now, is there a time and a place for the ducks to be introduced? Absolutely. I wouldn't turn them loose on teeny tiny little seedlings that can't withstand any footwork from the ducks. But as soon as the crops are established, that's typically the time that we start to see those pest pressures anyway. And so that's when the ducks are introduced. So we use them appropriately. We also have geese on the farm. We do, even though we live in central New Jersey, it's a surprise to many that we have very high predator pressure. In the beginning, we were losing a lot of ducks to fox, coyote. We also have mountain lion, black bear, your typical little guys like bobcats. We've got fisher cats, and the list goes on and on. So initially, before I really understood the role of guardian geese, I thought, okay, they'll sound their alarm and keep the predators away. That's not really what they do. What they do is they sound their alarm to alert the rest of the flock, being our ducks, that something is in the area, something abnormal, a predator, an intruder, and they take cover. The other thing that geese do that has been hugely beneficial is the term weeder geese is there for a reason. They go through our pasture spaces, around fence posts, they go into our yard and they graze grass and leafy weeds. So they're eating something that the ducks don't eat, and also that our other animals don't eat, that we'll talk about in a little bit. So they help to sort of weed the lawn and maintain some of these growing spaces for us. The last of our bird or avian members of our farm are guinea fowl. I came down with Lyme's disease a couple of years ago. So did my dogs. I'm not sure if it's current, but at least for a couple of years, I currently live in the most tick-infested county in the United States. And Lyme's is a very serious threat to any outdoor worker. So I decided we needed to get rid of the ticks. I did not want to eradicate deer. I didn't want to take away any members of wildlife that were contributing to tick populations. I just needed something that was going to help to keep the tick population in control. And while we had ducks and geese, they don't specifically seek out ticks. They do ingest some as they forage, but that's not what they really love to go after. That's what guineas do. And so we just have a very small block of guineas on our 6 acres, and they have drastically reduced not only our tick population, but our mosquitoes as well, which was a really surprising benefit that I didn't know that we were going to incur. When you have this many birds on your farm and all of these naturally occurring predators and members of wildlife, as a sustainable farmer, my intention is not to eradicate members or inhabitants of wildlife that already live here and have lived here for generations before I moved in. So what we do is we communicate the boundary line between what our farm and domestic animals reside in and where the wildlife lives. And the way that I do that is with a livestock guardian dog. I thought initially that's what the guardian geese were going to do, but they are not physically able to withstand pressure from a predator. They can sound their alarm, but that's where the dog comes in. The dog, being a predator itself, is much more of a threat to a coyote or a fox or a fisher cat than a goose is going to be. And simply by barking, most predators understand the line and they leave. If something is persistent, if something is rabid, the dog has taken care of it. And we have not lost a bird under his guardianship. I actually do not use a coop. My birds, I believe in setting up a system where they are allowed to live 24/7, 365, like natural ducks and geese. It reduces ventilation issues by keeping birds in a coop year round. It reduces the amount of work. It also reduces the amount of manure that I'm constantly flipping into compost. And so what this does is allow them to live their duck and avian lives like they're supposed to outside, all under the protection of a guard dog. Next, we have the sheep. So we're moving away from our, and because we have a 6-acre farm, we have a lot of grassy forage areas. Many people, when they start incorporating smaller livestock, think of goats, but they're very good and successful when it comes to eating more woody vegetation. We have a lot of leafy grasses where I'm located, and so sheep are much better fit for us. I absolutely do have to shear them every year. It doesn't hurt the sheep. I send their wool into a local mill and we knit our socks from it. But the reason I have the sheep is more for land maintenance and for what they do. There's their guard dog, for what they do for the horses. I've always been a horse lover. I always wanted a horse at the farm, and it always makes sense to me to have a working horse so I can stack functions. I don't just have horses for riding. I have horses for riding, pulling, and for composting their manure, turning it into organic matter and usable nutrients for my growing spaces. The thing a lot of people don't realize about domesticated livestock is they are created to coexist with one another in rotational grazing systems. When you keep horses or cows and sheep and or goats in a rotational grazing setting, they do not share many parasites. Rather, what they do is they ingest one another's parasitic larvae, and the cycle is broken. We no longer have to do dewormers. What we do is we do a responsible rotational grazing schedule, and the sheep keep the horses healthy by ingesting their parasites before the horses return to that location. And the horses do the same for the sheep. So it's a closed loop grazing system that requires no added inputs. There's us bringing in a flower harvest. And that's where I'll close out the animal portion of the working ecosystem before we get to vegetation and gardening and growing food.
That was so fun. I have read Angela's book. My screen's blurry. You can't see it. It's her book, I promise. And it's so delightful, and there's so many wonderful pictures in here. And but it's just so, it's like an extra, it's icing on the cake to get to hear you talk about it and share photos live. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. No, thank you for allowing me a space to explain what we do and why I have so many animals.
Someone wrote in the chat, "This is awesome," with a little duck emoji.
Oh, I love it.
All right. So I learned a term from you when reading the book, phenology. I know it in the context of learning and studying languages. I had never thought about applying it to earthwork, so to speak.
Sure.
So I was wondering if you could explain what it is and how you observed it in your homestead.
Yeah, I think I came about phenology organically, just through all of the obsessive research that I was doing about holistic gardening and farming. And it made a lot of sense to me. So phenology, in this sense, is the study of weather patterns with regard to how that weather affects plants and animals. So I use it most heavily in springtime when it comes to planting. But you might have heard some of the other adages like, red sky at night, sailor's delight, or a ring around the moon means snow or rain is falling soon. There are these old sayings that are based on centuries of observations. And it's what growers, people of all professions really just use to conduct daily life when it comes to predicting weather before we had weather apps, weathermen, or even before we had seed packets. And so what I mean by that is, for example, when I see the crocus, the snowdrops bloom first where I'm at in New Jersey in the spring. And I know shortly thereafter, the crocus is going to come up. And when the crocus comes up, that's my signal that, all right, planting season begins. It's time to put peas in the ground. And the reason that these philosophies or sayings have been established is because we know that as the temperatures are warming, the ground is thawing, there's different levels of humidity that are changing. Natural plants around us are going to start adapting and responding accordingly that have same growth habits as domesticated food crops. And so I just use, I've been sharing these on Instagram as we go throughout the planting season. I just used my last one and shared that when the maple leaves unfurl, that's when you want to plant out your tender annuals. Now, obviously, is this something that's completely 100% foolproof? No, but neither are our average frost dates, right? So I still keep row cover at hand until well past Memorial Day, especially because weather has gotten so predictable. But you can really start to see a relationship between, there's an interesting one about the Japanese beetles will start to appear when the lily of the valley blooms. And so if you can research things online and Farmers on a great resource for these images. Really, it's fun and it's really interesting, and oftentimes I find that they're quite relevant.
That's so interesting. All right. You mentioned when you and you're in the first question that you're concerned about the chemicals and whatnot that are found in commercial food. So I was wondering if you could paint us a picture of the rise of synthetic fertilizers and how that replaced natural animal fertilizers and how you manage that on your homestead.
Sure. So yeah, absolutely. Um, I'm not going to go into fear mongering or anything like that. One thing that I found that was super interesting uh, was when I was doing some research and studying for my book that I was writing, because I've been using I've implemented a no synthetic fertilizer, pesticide, any spray whatsoever philosophy on my homestead since we started. And I had this really bad allergic reaction at an orchard where I was picking fresh apples, and I love apples. And because I ate so many, I was consuming this pesticide, and it set me into this whole deal with the ER. And so that's kind of why I implemented this practice. And so when I was doing research for the book, The Sustainable Homestead, there was this really interesting study that I found from a long, long time ago, like 1930s, 40s. And these two brothers were studying what was happening when people would apply synthetic nitrogen to crops. And so what was happening is they were applying the nitrogen at a rate that the crops couldn't really absorb. Yes, they need nitrogen, but they need other things too, and they don't really need it every day. And so this excess of nitrogen was being put on these crops, and the crops would start to suffer. And so the brothers were
Oh, it looks like we lost her for a moment. Let's just give it a second. Angela, if you can hear me, I can't hear you.
local rivers and streams. There was just too much of it, and that was contributing to algae blooms.
Angela, excuse me, sorry.
Yeah,
Your
yeah.
sound cut out for about 30 seconds.
Did it really?
Yeah.
Okay, where did I cut off at?
Um, that you were explaining how the brothers were testing the synthetic nitrogen and
Okay,
yeah,
okay, I'll back up. Sorry about that.
that's okay.
So they saw that these farmers were thinking when the crops were wilting because of this nitrogen application that, oh, they must just need more nitrogen. So they were adding even more nitrogen. Well, what was happening under the soil surface is all this excess nitrogen that the plant couldn't really absorb was running off down in through the soil and into the water table. And what happened then is it was feeding into the rivers and waterways, and it was creating this massive algae bloom. And so it had a larger effect, a much larger effect than that one individual series of crops. The other thing that they found is that there is an entire network underneath the soil surface of beneficial fungi, mycorrhiza, there's microbes, there's protozoa, there's nematodes. They're, regardless of what they're called, it's an absolutely massive ecosystem. And while that sounds really cool in itself, what it does is even more amazing. They surround and create this little protective shield that covers every single root fiber. And they actually communicate with the plant. So scientists have discovered that the plant will say, I need nitrogen. And they say, we'll get it for you. And they go and they get the nitrogen and they pull it up from the soil layers. They feed it to the plant. And in exchange, they feed off sloughed off plant cells or exudates from the plant. And the reason this is really important is because not only are they getting nitrogen, they're getting carbon, magnesium, water, all the things that a plant naturally needs to thrive and thus create nutrient-dense food. When we synthetically add that nitrogen, for example, that whole network dies because it's no longer needed and it's overfed with one item and it kills it off. The plant now, we did it a disservice. It does not know how to survive without intervention from the grower or the farmer. And not only that, we've killed the soil. That soil ecosystem is what creates good soil that feeds our crops, feeds us to create nutrients. And this is where that whole thing comes in with over farming and dead soil. these synthetics, when misapplied, kill our soils. And so instead of focusing on building soil, adding mycorrhiza, composting and adding compost, mixing different plants to facilitate a healthy soil network, we've just focused on nutrients that the plant could already get on its own anyway. And so I think as a misunderstanding, we've kind of gotten to a detrimental place with decreasing soil health. And so that's why I stay away from synthetics. Does that answer your question?
Definitely. Thank you. And just to continue along this line of conversation, what are some of those natural ways to repair soils?
Yeah, so this is something I've had to deal with personally, because the farm that I lived at was sprayed with Roundup for like 50 years before I moved here. And 10 years ago, when I moved in, I couldn't put a shovel in the soil to plant a tree, even though it looked lush on top. Underneath, the soil was absolutely dead. So the first thing I did is I incorporated no tilling. When you till, it seems like it's going to be really beneficial in the beginning. But any subsoil activity, like we just talked about, with all that beneficial bacteria and fungi, when you till, you dig that up and you flip it on top of the soil. And so, yeah, in the immediate moment, it might kill that weed, but you've also killed all the good stuff that's underneath. And not only do you have to replant something, you have to rebuild that entire ecosystem. The other thing is, many weeds, I forgot the name at this particular moment, but as soon as they're broken and they're dropped back on the top of the soil, let's just say it's snapped in half, it's now cloned itself and you have two of the same plant. So a lot of these weeds, you end up planting more weeds by trying to flip them. So rather than focus on tilling, I focused on, in areas that are now our pastures with weedy overgrowth, brush hogging. We went through once with a mower on a 5-inch setting, and we plowed everything, not plowed, I mean, we mowed it all down. This meant that a lot of the noxious weeds we didn't want died, and it left softer vegetation underneath to continue to grow, like we were mowing grass. We did another pass a month later on a 5-inch blade. We would continue to overseed and start putting in the things that we want, because all of this dead matter from these plants that we had knocked down, they create sort of like a straw situation or a mulch, right? And when you overseed in there, it gives it carbon and the seed can sprout and grow. And so by doing this, we're starting to bring the soil back to life, because we're not killing off what is already in existence. Rather, we're starting to facilitate natural decay, and we're allowing that natural bacteria to start to break down the organic matter we gave back to the soil through brush hopping, or you could also do sheet mulching. The other thing we want to do is, a lot of people think that compost is a fertilizer. Compost, in the long run, once it's liquefied into compost tea, could be considered a fertilizer. But compost is really a lot of organic matter that's broken down and has a ton of mycorrhizal activity in there. It should be thought of more as a soil conditioner. So if you can spread finished compost on something, you are essentially feeding your soil bacteria that it needs to thrive. This is why compost tea is starting to gain more traction, because plants don't soak up solids. They soak up liquids. And so until compost is turned into a liquid, it can't soak up the nutrients from it. So that's why compost tea is important. So that would be a natural form of fertilizer that isn't going to be synthetic, and is something that would naturally form on its own in the long run, by way of this organic matter compost breaking down. The other recommendation that I have that we did is we revived our soil with cover crops. So cover crops are essentially, like, I think of them as desired crops. For us, it's forage, because we feed our animals these cover crops also, and they give different things back to the soil. The Rodale Institute is an amazing resource. They have organic farming cover crop tables full of information that show different plants for different climates, for even different times of the year based on your seed sowing schedule. And it talks about different cover crops that will pull up nitrogen from deep within the soil's layers. It talks about things that help to suppress weeds, things that attract beneficial insects. things that will help provide tilth and break up compacted soils, which is really useful for us and our clay area. So starting to get into not just one cover crop, but mixing cover crops for different, to serve different functions is really helpful in reviving soil. So does that help to answer your question?
Definitely. Thank you.
Okay.
And I'll just a side note, Climate Victory Gardens encourages many of those practices you named.
Yay.
Yeah. So as you transformed your homestead into this permaculture haven, what changes did you start to observe? Like, for example, did you notice new critters coming out?
Yeah, so the first thing we noticed was our soil was healthier. I can now plant trees in softer soil that's much more nutrient dense than have to sit there and bang a shovel into it over and over again. So that's a really great thing to see. The other thing is that we are seeing a massive resurgence of wildlife into our little community that we've created. So we only have 6 acres, but we have a list. We have tons of bird species that hang out here either on their migration trail or they have just set up nests. Really cool birds that are starting to flock to our little area. We even have bald eagles all of a sudden that have taken to nesting in our trees. We have owl families moving in. And I think that that is such a wonderful marker or sign from nature that we're doing the right things, we're on the right path. And I think it's really, really important before integrating any animals into your homestead to take a look at what already is naturally thriving, because it doesn't make sense to bring in a domestic species that you're going to have to feed and maintain if there's already a natural version that already thrives and resides here doing that for you. So one example I always use is if you have a lot of owls, that's really great for your rodent pressure. Don't ask them to leave. There are ways to protect your ducklings or your baby chicks from those owls without having to eradicate the birds, because then you're going to see a rise in predator pressure, or excuse me, a rise in your mice populations. So I think it's really important to foster a home and create a homestead that is not only employing domestic, but also wild animals. But yes, we've seen a large amount of birds. Praying mantis, though, we have seen so many praying mantis in our growing spaces. And if you are familiar with them, you know that they are like an army all on their own of insects that are, they eat predators, predatory insects, and they're amazing. We have so many praying mantis. And obviously we have the honeybees, but we also have a lot of natives. And it's just been really cool to see.
Yeah, very neat. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
How has homesteading affected your overall health and well-being and that of your families, if I may ask that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me personally, I am a much happier person when I'm outside and I get to experience sunlight firsthand or through the clouds every single day. Um, I think that a lot of the anxiety and even some of the depression issues I had before was because I, at least, was experiencing a disconnect with nature. And now I have more of a connection and I feel more plugged in. And through cultivating plants and, fostering these animals and seeing them work together and feeding my family and having friends over, that just, it's all based on a harvest dinner. To me, that is really, really prideful and something that I feel very passionately about, as opposed to going to the store and buying something. So I would much rather spend all my money on plants than the obsessive shoe collection I had in my early 20s. It's just something where I think I have grown and evolved and changed, and I feel much more at peace in my soul and in myself. And I feel like I'm creating a stronger sense of purpose, and hopefully hopefully serving as a good role model for my children, that they know where their food comes from, and they're more plugged in as well.
I love that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What are for the folks joining us today, What are some small steps that they could take to get started with transforming their own land, regardless of size, into a sustainable homestead?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a screen if I can be so bold as to ask to share again.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's just flip over here. Okay. So I think regardless of whether you live in an apartment, a flat, a high-rise building, or if you have 1,000 acres, I think the first and one of the biggest things we can all do is just embrace the seasons. When we embrace the seasons, we tend to eat seasonally. We tend to employ plants and activities in our daily lifestyle that are conducive to what is happening around us. So basically, rather than fighting the atmosphere or fighting the season, we're just sort of living more in the moment. Rather than in the springtime, try to, find butternut squash, embrace the fact that it's spring and we have fresh strawberries, and then enjoy the butternut squash when it's more appropriate for most of us here in the US, which is going to be in the fall. And in doing that, then our food travels less. It's picked at a much more nutrient dense time in the life cycle of the plant. And there's just so many benefits that come with all of those things. The other thing we can do is accept natural inhabitants. So if you are living on a high-rise floor and you have a balcony and you have some plants and you see that there are a lot of honeybees, maybe plant something that the honeybees can absorb some nectar from. Also, if you have a lot of land, like we talked about before, embrace that there are owls, understand where the fox den is. Rather than struggle and try to push back and fight nature, there is a lot of peace and it is much easier to accept what is there. Companion planting is huge. Not only can you grow more in a small space, even if it's just one potted tomato, but now you're creating a more healthy ecosystem or habitat for the plant. So if you have a potted tomato, you can plant radishes, cilantro, other herbs are great companions, even carrots if your pot is deep enough. And what that does is it creates just some variability in the biodiversity around that plant. You're going to get more insects visiting your plant to help pollinate, maybe some predatory insects to keep unwanted bugs off of there. And you're going to give and take more things to the soil between the plants to create this nice little ecosystem that keeps everybody healthy and happy. The other thing that you can do is incorporate more perennials. Perennials in any growing space, especially if you are just in a yard, you just have a backyard garden. If you have a lot of acres, perennials come back every year, yes, and that means less labor with bigger harvests every year, yes, but what it really does is it creates a living space for wild birds and insects to overwinter. And that means that come the following spring, after you have planted that perennial, you're going to have some critters there that are already there to help you keep your codling moth, if you're growing apples, in check. They're there to help you keep unwanted bugs away. So start thinking about not only growing food, but creating habitats where we can have our natural helpers around to help us keep pests in check. We talked about building soil. And again, this is more about less focus on feeding one thing nitrogen, feeding one thing nutrients, more about building healthy soil that can facilitate a healthy plant. We hear sometimes people say, oh, well, if you plant too many things in one growing space, they're going to compete for nutrients. That should not be a thing. The soil should be so nutrient dense and so loaded with earthworms and bacteria and beneficial fungi that it doesn't matter how many things you've planted in there. Just like if you look at a healthy forest floor, it's able to sustain those plants. They are strong and they are healthy. They are thriving because we have healthy, nutrient-dense soil. Making and using compost is one of the easiest things we can do, no matter the size of our home. If you are cooking and creating food scraps, you can compost in a small bucket. You can compost in a large 3-tier garden system if you want to. But 40% of greenhouse gases are said to come from anaerobic activity from kitchen scraps that can't break down because they don't have the proper access that they need to air. We can help cut down on those greenhouse gases and we can nurture our garden soil at the same time just by composting. When we create less waste, obviously, we're not bringing in as many inputs. We don't have as much packaging. But also when we start to work with what we have, that could be a trellis system that you want to create out of, I don't know, clothes hangers, bamboo poles, anything. If you want to create, we've all seen those little egg carton recyclable seed starting containers. When we buy less, we create less garbage. There's less pollution by way of transportation of those products to stores and then to our homes. So creating less waste and just using what we have is really important in sustainable homesteading and growing. One of the biggest things we can do is we can plant what works for us. I have tried to have cold hardy olives here in Zone 7 in central New Jersey. I am just not there. My climate is just not there. And I'm not going to go out and wrap Christmas lights around my olive trees as much as I would love to. I need to embrace where I'm at, and I need to grow what's appropriate in my growing zone. This is less labor intensive. It's less waste because now I shipped 4 olive trees here that can't grow here. And so now that was for nothing. There's garbage. That's an example of that. Grow what works for you in your zone and trade or sell and buy with others that can grow something successfully that you can't. Observe your site, no matter if you are on a small rented yard or if you have a large acreage. Observe what is there before you do anything. You saw in the beginning of the presentation that I have a flood-prone property where I initially wanted to put my garden. Turned out it would have been in a floodplain. It was not disclosed to us that we had a floody area. And so if I had put my garden there, it would have completely washed away. All of the work and crops and time would have been for nothing. Do yourself a favor and not only observe weather patterns that are in your future growing space or your homestead, but also observe the wildlife that's there, where the snow piles up. All of these things are really important to create less labor and less waste in the long run. And then lastly, understand that these solutions that you come up with are unique to you, what you're growing, your geographical location, your neighbor's yard, what they are doing, the soil they have, it is all very different compared to what is going on at your particular site. This is really hard to remember when we have social media at the click of a button on our phones, and when we have Pinterest. We see something and we want that for ourselves. But like I said, I can't necessarily grow these olives without a ton of extra inputs, and that's not a very good permaculture sustainable solution. So instead, understand that what is happening in your backyard or in your growing space needs to be unique to the soil you have and where you're at, and not what other people are doing. So I know I threw a lot of info at you there, but hopefully there's some things for everybody.
And those are some great tips. Thank you.
Hmm.
Before I ask a few audience questions, is there anything you want to share that I didn't think to ask you?
No, we covered a lot today, and I really hope that it didn't overwhelm folks. All of this is broken down in my book, The Sustainable Homestead. I tried to offer solutions that are scalable to whether you have a quarter acre, to whether you have 10 acres, just a backyard. There are all sorts of solutions and suggestions in there for being more sustainable and intentional with your growing space.
Yeah, I can't say enough good things about the book. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Melissa asks if there's a list of ideal permaculture crops for a given area or by using the hardiness zones. Do you have a recommendation where we could find?
I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Different plants do different things. Some provide food, some we don't harvest. We just use them for what they give to the soil. Typically speaking, some of the heavy hitters in many regions of the United States are going to be sunchokes, also called Jerusalem artichokes. They're native to many regions of the US. They are very thick and very dense. They produce a hedge and they produce edible tubers, though they don't agree with some people. The other one is elderberry. If you're in the eastern United States, that's absolutely a wonderful crop to grow, and it can be used for a myriad of things. Comfrey is debatable, but there is a sterile version that does not spread. Russian comfrey, I can attest to that. is in my yard. I grow it in several spaces. It does not take over. It grows more as an upright shrub, mines loads of nutrients to the soil. You can chop it, spread it around as a mulch to allow it to decay, and it will regrow several times in a season. So those are a few very heavy hitters that many permaculture growers tend to incorporate into their spaces.
And did you mention earlier the Rodale Institute has some resources for planting
Yes.
crops?
Yeah, for cover crops. It's amazing.
Okay.
And it's free. Yes.
Yeah. And I always like to recommend people check out their land grant university resources. Part of your tax dollars fund those, so a lot of their resources are free as well. Nancy asks if you include any foraging in your practice.
We do actually. One of the reasons I don't grow your typical raspberry bushes on the property is because we have a lot of wine berries that grow naturally here. And so for me, the wineberry has kind of taken the place of a raspberry. And we forage for those every year as we do blackcap raspberries and blackberries.
Yum. Gary asked if you use any wine cap mushrooms or anything else like that to help with your soil.
I don't. I do use, if I have to purchase any raised bed mix, if I want to top off, if I want to start a new raised bed, I'll use compost. But then I also purchase a mushroom or mycorrhiza inoculated gardening soil. So I do go about it that way, but I do not grow my own.
And then Catherine asks, or she shared that she has a patch of dirt that has a lot of shade, and she's thinking of adding clover to it. Do you think this is a good idea, or have suggestions for how she should proceed?
Sure. It depends what you're using the land for. If it's just a yard space that you maybe sit in from time to time or don't really frequent, then yes, clover is great. It's a good feeder for a lot of pollinators, honeybees, native bees. But if it's something where you want to take advantage of the space and grow food, especially if it tends to stay a little more on the damp side, you could try growing rice under there. It does well in shade.
Wow,
And rice is heavily undercultivated in the United States and can do very well in certain growing conditions.
that's so cool. I never would have thought of rice. That's
Yeah, isn't
fun.
that cool?
Yeah. Um, Lynn asks if you have any tips for raising composting worms.
So in the beginning, people tend to think that they need to buy worms to start a compost heap. And I guess it depends on what you're putting in your compost. If it's strictly vegetables and, newspaper, cardboard, that sort of thing, then yes, you might want to either get some from a local composter where they would just let you take some worms, or you can order them online. But if you are using any animal waste whatsoever, I guarantee they are going to find their way to you. I have never added worms to any compost heap, and we have many, and they are chock full of them. And it did not take a long time for me to see them either. So I'm willing to bet if you have horses, sheep, goats, cattle, any animal, don't worry, they will find their way to you very quickly.
Oh, and follow up to the rice question, or the question that you said rice would be a good idea. Do you have a recommendation for a type of rice?
Again, it depends if where you're located. If you're in the north, wild rice is going to be great. Um, I could be misremembering. Territorial Seed Company, I think, sells rice, and I believe I got some from them. It could have been a seed company though, but there are a lot of native, or excuse me, there are a lot of small seed outfits that do sell rice. I would just do a little research as to what type is going to be best for your geographical location.
Great. Okay. Any final questions, dear audience members? I'll just give it a second to see if anyone sends one in. Oh, I have a feeling I know your answer to this, but what about rye as a cover crop?
Rye definitely is a cover crop. I do an annual rye every year as part of a cover crop blend that we put in. in the fall, or yes, in the fall for overwintering.
Oh, do you have any experience with bunnies?
Yes, actually, we did have several bunnies for a while, and I would use them in my garden. I have this garden proper where I do the annuals, and I do cover crops in those raised beds. I built this little enclosure. You can see it on my YouTube and on my Instagram account. And they're able to get access to the bottom. So when I moved their run, they would eat up the cover crop for me. And this is the first year I haven't had them, and my labor has definitely been cut out for me in pulling out my cover crop by hand a little bit more than when I had the rabbits do it for me. So yes, the rabbits were a big contributor here.
I'm just answering a question in the chat. Okay. And I said any final questions and they're coming in, and now the chat's moving so quickly. Do you have any recommendations for growing sunflowers, and what cover crops might be a good companion with them?
Oh, that's a good question. There is a mix called Summer Max, again, territorial seed company, and it comes with sunflowers and a whole host of other things like vetch cow peas and some other leguminous plants, maybe a berseem clover. And those do really well in a summer cover crop mix. If you are looking for an edible situation, you wouldn't want to grow with a sunchoke. Those sunchokes are considered native or wild sunflowers. They are allelopathic. They do secrete a little bit of a toxin into the soil. It's not detrimental to your health, but it's enough that other plants around them might not like it. If you are growing domesticated sunflowers, those are compatible with a whole host of domesticated crops. The three sisters, the sunflowers is actually the fourth sister. So your beans, your squash, those are all great companions to go with sunflowers.
Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's wrap it up with could you explain what the differences are between permaculture and regenerative agriculture? Because they are not quite the same thing.
They are not quite the same thing. So with permaculture, we are strictly trying to mimic patterns in nature, to not only restore soil health, but to also be able to feed ourselves, create thriving animals. Regenerative agriculture, we have a lot in common, but it doesn't focus solely on organic or all natural methods. So for example, in permaculture, we wouldn't use pigs in creating a silvopasture or to clear woods, because in permaculture, we're trying to absorb carbon into the soil and not disturb the roots. However, in a lot of regenerative agricultural practices, they use pigs. So while that is a quote unquote natural means of clearing land, you are allowing all of that carbon to be released into the atmosphere, and you're killing a ton of plants in doing so. And so they're just a little bit different. Is one way right or wrong? No, I think you have to do what's best for you and also your site and your geographical location. I think regenerative agriculture also tends to use a lot of inoculants to increase mycorrhizal activity when they're trying to rebuild soil. We're looking at bringing in just compost, again, brushing or brush hogging, sheet mulching, not really disturbing anything.
And I think that permaculture has more of a philosophy around creating like sustainable systems, essentially, like a sustainable food system, and
I think it tends to bleed more into an entire life cycle,
yeah.
lifestyle. Some people kind of even call it a cult. I wouldn't go that far, but I think somebody who is naturally minded that wants to mimic patterns in nature, they're naturally not going to want to have other facets of their life be consumed by mass consumerism practices, for example, right? So it just kind of tends to go hand in hand, I think.
Yeah. Oh. Move my screens here. Okay. Well, Angela, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to all of you for joining us today and being a part of Green America's Climate Victory Gardens community. Together, we can make a real difference in creating positive change for our planet and its people. You can keep the momentum going and stay connected by subscribing to our newsletter to remain informed about our latest campaigns, events, and sustainability tips. Your support fuels our work toward a greener, fairer future. Please consider donating today to help us continue our vital programs and initiatives, including these free gardening webinars. Every contribution counts. Remember, your actions matter, and together we can build a more sustainable and just world. Thank you for your commitment to creating positive change, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Mm.